In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a young psychologist at Yale University, started an experiment that would become one of the most shocking in the history of psychology. It began with a simple question: could ordinary people commit cruel acts just because someone in authority told them to? The world had just watched the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi official who claimed he was just following orders. Milgram wanted to understand how such obedience worked. So he built a fake machine, invited volunteers, and told them it was a study on learning and memory. The setup looked harmless. A man in a white lab coat met the volunteer and explained the task. The volunteer would be the teacher. Another man, introduced as the learner, would be placed in a separate room and strapped to a chair with wires. The teacher would read word pairs. If the learner gave the wrong answer, the teacher would press a button to give an electric shock. What the volunteer didn't know was that the learner was an actor. There were no real shocks, but the teacher believed everything was real. At first, the shocks were small, 15 volts, then 30, 45, and so on. The learner made mistakes on purpose. After a few shocks, he began to scream. At 150 volts, he shouted, "Let me out!" At 180, he cried, "I can't stand the pain." At 300 volts, he refused to answer. At 330, he was silent. The teacher often hesitated. Some laughed nervously. Others questioned the lab coat man. But the man calmly repeated phrases like, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice." The shocks went up to 450 volts. A red label under the switch read XXX. Most volunteers showed signs of extreme stress, sweating, trembling, even biting their lips, but many still continued. Before the experiment, Milgram asked other psychologists how many people would go all the way. They guessed maybe 1%, only a true psychopath. But the results were shocking. 65% of participants delivered the final 450-volt shock. They weren't violent people. They weren't cruel. They were regular citizens, teachers, engineers, salesmen. They obeyed not because they wanted to hurt, but because an authority figure told them it was necessary. They believed they had no choice. Some said, "I didn't want to do it, but he told me to." Others blamed the man in the white coat. "I thought he knew what he was doing." Milgram ran the experiment with women. The results were the same. He changed the location from Yale to a small office building. Still the same. He changed the white coat to a regular man in jeans. Obedience dropped. But when the man in the coat returned, obedience rose again. He also tested what happened when two other teachers, actors, refused. When they said, "This is wrong," and stopped, the real participant often followed. But when the others obeyed, most continued too. People didn't want to be the first to say no. The experiment spread fear and fascination. Newspapers called it disturbing. People asked if Milgram had gone too far, but others saw it as necessary. After all, it showed how easily humans can be led. Milgram once said, "The most fundamental lesson of our study is this: ordinary people can become agents in a terrible process." He believed the real danger wasn't in monsters, but in blind obedience. Years later, new versions of the experiment were tried. In 2009, a team recreated it using actors and milder conditions. Still, 70% of people obeyed. The numbers stayed the same, even decades later. The Milgram experiment remains one of the most famous studies in psychology. It didn't answer all questions, but it forced people to look deeper into human nature. Why do we obey? When do we say no? And how far would we go just because someone told us to?